Welcome to Module 4 video for English 100 Asynchronous. In this module, you'll be focused on looking at word choices, how to make sure that you are using inclusive language that demonstrates respect to all people, and some information on tense. So as a throwback to Module 2, recall that we don't use a lot of language in academic writing that does not mean what it literally says. So we're avoiding use of slang, contractions, cliches, colloquialisms, idioms, euphemisms, personification, and anything else that could be considered unclear or provoking bias. You also need to watch out for any words that might be homonyms or homophones. So these are words that sound the same but have different meanings or uses or spellings. So common ones we see are to, and to. These are all used differently. They all function differently. I should never see your with an apostrophe there in your writing because that's a contraction. You would actually have to write out you are, and the other your indicates possession. The there, same ideas, counsel. There are a lot of these types of words in English that sound the same but are used very differently. So make sure you are using the correct words in your writing. Now, part of this is understanding the connotation of a word. And so different words, the way they have been used towards people or through history, can change the way that that word is interpreted. It also speaks to any implied meanings beyond that word that might make them feel positive or negative or somewhere in between. Now, if you're writing in a persuasive way where you're trying to convince the reader of something, sometimes the use of certain words might be more effective than others that have their same meanings. So for example here, all these words on the top line are considered synonyms of one another, words that mean similar things. However, if I call somebody old, that's a descriptive piece. It's not always invited, certainly. But if I call somebody decrepit, that has a very negative connotation. If I say that something that is old is an antique, that gives it a very positive, trendy sort of vibe. If I say that I want to buy things that are affordable, that's pretty neutral because what is affordable for you might be different than what's affordable for me, but it's talking about here how we want to make sure it fits into whatever budget I have. If you call somebody cheap though, or say that something is cheap, often that has this negative connotation that it might be made poorly or that it's not good quality. Whereas if I say something is inexpensive, even though technically that means the same thing as cheap, it has a very different feeling attached to it. It almost sounds like we've done something good by saving some money on this. And so there are a lot of words in English and in other languages too, specific, that do have these implied or attached or historical associations that mean we have to use them in different places. And this is one of those reasons why, if you don't know how a word is properly used, you should not use it in your writing. I see, unfortunately, many students who will use a word because they think it sounds academic or because they saw somebody else use this word, but they don't themselves understand the use. And so in their writing, they put it in there and it doesn't make sense. It makes the whole sentence confusing because you have this one word that is not being used appropriately or in a way that makes sense. How we order or use our words can change our meanings as well. Another thing that's important to note is when a word is misspelled, it really pops out at the reader. Similarly, with those words that are confusing because they don't really seem to fit the information they're placed with. And so that can result in your reader being confused about what you mean and affects how your information is interpreted by the reader. And that can make it look unprofessional. So again, try to be careful about the words you choose. Make sure you understand how they are used. Don't try to use a fancy word that you see in a thesaurus, for example, that you haven't actually worked with, used, had experience with. So, as an example here, I was stingy with my money because I was trying to save up. Stingy might give you a negative response because it often has a negative connotation based on its use in English. If I replaced stingy with thrifty, I was thrifty with my money because I was trying to save up. Thrifty has a positive connotation, tends to sound better. But these words both appear in thesauruses as synonyms, but we use them differently. So make sure you understand the words you are using. It is better to use simple and plain words that you understand rather than use fancy or academic words that might not be used correctly, and there will create a confusing sentence or confusing set of sentences based on how you're using it. Now, on top of this, we also need to be incredibly considerate about how we talk about others. And in APA, which is what we need to use for our formatting, for our citations, and for our references, there's also requirements to use inclusive and respectful language and being bias-free in your language use around others. So one of the ways we do this is by using person-first language, where we identify the person ahead of any characteristics they have. So instead of saying a disabled person, we would say a person with disabilities. And on the Moodle, under this module, you are required to download and go through the inclusive language guide that APA has developed for writers to make sure that when you are writing about others, whether it's about people with exceptionalities or people of different cultures or different beliefs, you're making sure you're using appropriate language that doesn't have those negative connotations. And this is all based on research and studies done with people from various cultural groups on what they find the most respectful way to be identified as in writing. So make sure whenever you're talking about others that you refer to the inclusive language guide to make sure you're using language that is appropriate. Now, that person-first language is often compared to what's called identity-first language. Identity-first language is where we identify people in our writing or even in our speaking based on a diagnosis or an aspect of their identity. So calling somebody a drug user or autistic or Down syndrome, that really limits the person to that specific diagnosis. Similarly, if we identify all people in a cultural group as the same, it makes it so individuals within that cultural group don't have any autonomy for their own uniqueness. So best practice in writing is to use person-first language to identify that this diagnosis or this particular characteristic of their identity does not define them completely. There are some individuals who do very strongly identify with their diagnoses. So, for example, I have a friend who has autism and she just calls herself autistic because it pervades so many parts of her life. However, we always want to give people the option. So, by using person first language instead of identity first, we are using language that shows that respect towards individuals. You also want to be careful about how you talk about people within your writing who might have differences. Sometimes I see suffers from or victim of when it's something that the person has lived with their whole life. So, in one paper I've read in the past, somebody said this person suffers from autism. The problem with that is that the person who has autism has had it their whole life. In their mind, they're not suffering. This is their normal. So, by using words like suffers from or victim of, we are actually treating those people as being less than human or less than what we think that humans should be. Similarly, you want to be careful about over complimenting people who have differences. So, using phrases like overcome their disability or is courageous when they're just doing things that are normal for themselves. So, if somebody is on presenting up on a stage and they're talking about how their specific diagnosis has impacted them, that in and of itself doesn't make them courageous. It doesn't mean that they have overcome anything. They are just doing that to educate other people for understanding. So we have to be very careful about minimizing the existence of others who don't have the qualities or characteristics we might associate with normal. Similarly, within Canada, there's been a lot of negative and inaccurate language used for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. They have been given names by English, French, and sometimes Dutch peoples that are not the names they call themselves. And this is an issue across the world. For example, uh, what we call Japan in English, Japanese people called Nippon. And the word Japan and a lot of the other words that we use for different countries have been decided upon by people not in that country or not from those cultures. And it's sometimes have negative historical meanings as well. In English, there are many nations that have been renamed by English or French for no other reason than they didn't seem to care about learning the actual name the people call themselves. So this is a consideration if you are ever writing about First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. Other things to be aware of is the term Indigenous, quite frankly, right now is overused. Indigenous is a global term for people who are the original inhabitants of a place. So I have a friend who lives in Germany whose ancestors have lived in Germany for as long as she can go back in her genealogy. She is considered indigenous to Germany. So sometimes people want to use shorter phrases like indigenous to group all these peoples together, but it's problematic because it's not an accurate word. Similarly, in Canada, we do have negative histories with words like Indian, Native, Aboriginal, Native American, and those pieces. So one of your required activities for this module is to go through a H5P where you have to learn some more about the proper use of the terminology related to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. This also includes some guides on how to write about, because another way that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit have been dehumanized historically is by writing about them as if they were objects instead of groups of people. So things like capitalizing, for example, has been used to diminish First Nations, Métis, and Inuit in the English language. This information will be part of Quiz 3, so make sure you do that activity. Another thing that we have to be considerate about is how we speak about gender and sex. APA is very focused on the use of gender-neutral language to reduce implicit, so inside our head, gender bias. One of the reasons, and as you go into the next module and you do a lot of work on APA citation and formatting, one of the things you'll see is that we don't write out first names. In the references, we'll use an initial for first and a middle name if they have it, but we won't ever write them out. In the citations, we only ever use the last name. And that is because there has unfortunately been bias in research where, and especially this is true of men, unfortunately, men have dismissed or not looked at research written by women, even if those women are experts in their field. So part of the way to move back against this has been to eliminate some of the things that would indicate that a certain researcher or a scholar is male or female, so that that information can be shared regardless of how people feel about people of different genders or sexes. This also helps to serve translation into other languages because some languages don't have the same gender indicated in their vocabularies, and some languages also have more than 2 genders within their languages. So we need to be very considerate about this. Personally, I don't find this very difficult. I know that some people do, but so often it just takes a bit of rewording, using an individual instead of saying a boy or a girl, using they, their, them, to not make it so people are automatically thinking about people being male or female in these situations. And, I've got some examples down there. That APA Inclusive Language Guide does have more, and it talks more about why it is important to do this for the purpose of information sharing, persuasion, and overall inclusive activity. As noted earlier, another thing to watch for in your word choices are homonyms, homophones. These are things, again, that sound the same but have different meanings. Very specifically, a homonym is a word that is the same in sound and writing, but might have different meanings depending on how it is used. So homonyms, context is important. Where it is important. If I say the price is fair, I mean that the price makes sense for what the product is. If I say I am going to the fair, I'm no longer talking about something being good for what the product is. I'm talking about a specific place where it's like a carnival, or there's going to be rides and games to play. A homophone, so homo means the same, by the way. Phone has to do with sound. So homophone means same sound. And these are words that sound the same but have different meanings. So a flower, if I pick a flower, I'm talking about a plant that has these different petals, often quite attractive to the eye. There's also flour that we bake with. If I bake with flour, I'm not talking about the flowers I pick from my garden. I'm talking about oftentimes it's milled wheat that we use, although there's other kinds of flours as well. And it's a product. It's also related to a plant, but used differently. We also have homographs. This is a word that has the same spelling, but we might pronounce it differently. and it would have different meaning, again, depending on how it is used. So if I play bass guitar, I'm talking about a specific type of guitar that is used for rhythm. If I caught a bass fishing, that's a specific type of fish. So same spelling, but different meanings depending on use. Now, some of the most common homophones or homonyms I see are listed to the side here, but if you ever do a Google search on common homophones or homonyms, you will get an insanely long list. There are lots of them in writing. So one of the ways that you can check for this is by, again, using tools that are available to you. Asking ChatGPT or another AI tool, can you check this for any homonyms that might be confusing to the reader? That would be an acceptable way to use AI to make sure that you are not using words that could be interpreted in different ways. Common one I see when talking about education is knowing the difference between a principal and a principal. Principal, that's the head of your school. That's the person who's in charge of the other teachers at the school or for supervision and observation purposes. Principal, with the PLE, this is things that you believe in. So your principles, your personal principles. These are not the same, so make sure you spell them appropriately because it looks poorly when you get those wrong, especially if you work in education. Similarly, we go to Portage College with an E here. Sometimes on title pages, where students are expected to identify their affiliation, which will be spoken about in Module 5, people will accidentally write collage. A collage is when you take pictures from magazines and other places and glue them all together. It's sort of like an arts and crafts project. That's not the same as college. So make sure you're using the correct one on your title page, because if the title page is the first thing I'm seeing on a writing assignment and you already got that wrong, it lowers my expectations, unfortunately, because that's a simple one that you should make sure you're getting correct. Now, APA, through the Inclusive Language Guide, through looking at gender neutral words, there's some general things you need to remember for making sure your language use is bias-free in your academic writing. First is using that person-first language. We're not identifying people solely based on any disability or culture they have. It is something that is part of their identity but doesn't define them completely. We also want to watch out for any terminology that could contribute to stereotypes, whether negative or positive stereotypes. This is also outlined quite a bit in that APA Inclusive Language Guide to make sure that you are using terminology that is considered the most respectful towards different peoples. Making sure that you use inclusive language when you're talking about gender and sexual minorities. So what is often in Canada spoken about as LGBTQ2SA+. So they have a whole section in the Inclusive Language Guide about that. You also want to watch out for certain microaggressions, small things that we often do or say that we don't even think about the meanings of, because other people have said it and we just copy them and we don't think about it. But there are some terms in English that are used in a way that's disrespectful, that is inaccurate, and should be considered, why am I using this word? What does this word even mean? Lots of people don't realize that gypped is actually a negative reference to Romani people in terms of they will cheat you. Gypsies is the colloquial term for Romani peoples. Saying the word powwow when you actually mean a meeting. And this if somebody uses a powwow when they mean meeting, it tells me you don't know what a powwow is. A powwow is definitely not a meeting, at least none of the powwows I've been to. Or things where you are diminishing certain disorders or disabilities. So let's say you like things to be clean in your house. That does not mean you are OCD or have obsessive compulsive disorder. That means you're neat. If you are saying something like, I'm so OCD, I have to keep everything in its place, that really minimizes the experience of people who actually have diagnosed obsessive compulsive disorder such that it interferes with their ability to function in day-to-day life. Also, in general, just like with cliches and colloquialisms and idioms and all those things, make sure you mean what you say. Make sure your language use is accurate. Sometimes we use things like euphemisms to soften difficult topics. So we'll say committed suicide instead of died by suicide. Committed has a very different meaning if you look it up, but we say this to soften the discussion around these topics. In academic writing, we do want to focus on being very accurate with our language, again, so it will accurately translate into other languages if we decide to publish or share it. Now, tense, English has tense. Not all languages have tense, so this can be a difficult piece if you are learning English from a language that doesn't use tense. In English, we have past tense, so when we're speaking about things that have happened, we have present tense, and we have future tense for things that we expect will happen in the future. In academic writing, we use present tense as much as possible, unless we're speaking about historical events or past experiences. Again, this is to help with that idea of being able to read this in any language if we need to publish it or to share that knowledge. So past tense we use when we're describing historical events, when we're describing the results of completed research studies, or identifying things that have already occurred. Present tense is where we're talking about how research or other studies could influence or impact our understanding about something. So even if it's something that was studied prior, if we're talking about how that information could provide us new understandings, we're going to use present tense. Also, if those findings are still true from previously completed research. The only time we would expect a past to present shift within a sentence is when we're speaking about specific research that is still true. So in this sentence here, the doctor found, so found is past tense, that revising a document improves, so improves is present tense, the final grade by at least 10%. So this information from this particular study is still presumed to be true, so we do that past to present shift. And future tense, the only time we really use this in academic writing is when we're talking about solutions or actions that people or organizations can do in order to improve upon something. So talking about solutions or what should be done. In general, your writing should use specific, clear, and precise language. I should not be confused when I am reading about what you are talking about. If you use vague language or language that can be interpreted in different ways and haven't built out on it such that it is understood within that context, it becomes confusing. This is something that I see AI often does. So sometimes I end up having to investigate for AI misuse because you're using very, the language might be good and understood, but there's no examples, there's no connections to use. And so that makes it vague and imprecise. Similarly, avoiding those words or phrases that don't translate into other languages and have the same meanings. So cliches and colloquialisms and euphemisms, or any language that could bias or confuse the reader. Making sure that you understand how some words can have different interpretations, even if they technically mean similar things. Making sure that if you're writing about people or groups, that you are using that APA inclusive language guide to make sure you're using the most respectful language possible. When you're writing about or for First Nations, Métis, or Inuit, make sure you go through that guideline to understand the most appropriate terminology and when to use different language for different situations. Watch out for those words that are commonly confused because they sound the same or are written the same, but they might mean different things. In general, make sure you understand the words you are using. It is better to use simple and precise words than fancy words or words that you're not familiar with that could mean different things or not be interpreted properly. Use that person first language, use gender neutral language, do not use contractions. Again, going back to module 2, these are not existent in all languages and have difficulty in translation, so we do not use them. And as much as possible, using present tense within your writing. So for this module, make sure you complete the notes. You have to review and complete notes for Chapter 2 of Horkoff. You're going to review the APA Inclusive Language Guide. I do recommend having this available to you for Quiz 3 because there will be questions about it. And there are 5 required H5P activities on word choice and inclusive language, including the one on First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. At the end of all this, complete Quiz 3, and then move on to the next module.